There are a lot of organizations that can tell a story about how the program side of the organizations thrived. And by telling those types of stories, I think that's going to be what helps an organization stand apart and help raise additional money.
Welcome to the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange, a podcast from IPM Advancement. Our mission is to help you raise more money so you can make the world a better place. Today's topic, fundraising and COVID-19. 1 year later, what have we learned? Last year, early in the pandemic, we published a podcast episode titled Fundraising During COVID-19, Practical Strategies for Success. Since its release, it's been our most listened to episode, and with good reason. In the past year, many nonprofits have struggled to meet their fundraising goals. In-person events and services have been limited or canceled due to COVID restrictions, and for some nonprofits, demand for programs and services has increased while donations have dropped. Now, here we are 1 year later, and nonprofit fundraisers have learned so much during this time. In today's episode, we're going to unpack some of the most valuable lessons of the past year to help nonprofits come out on the other side of this pandemic even stronger than they were before. Leading today's panel discussion is Rich Frazier, IPM Advancement's Senior Consultant. Joining Rich is Jana Olslund and Penny Cowden. Jana Olslund specializes in the areas of annual fund, capital and endowment campaigns, and interim leadership staffing. In addition to her experience as Vice President of Philanthropy and Alumni Relations for Hazelton Betty Ford Foundation, Jana served as a senior consultant for Bentz Whaley Flessner, where she worked with health systems, children's hospitals, and health-related causes across the country. Penny Cowden has specialized in not-for-profit philanthropy for 25 years, with a focus on strategic planning, leadership development, and coaching. Penny holds the CFRE designation and has earned advanced certification as a fellow in the Association of Healthcare Philanthropy. Let's tune in now to hear what our panel has to say about fundraising and COVID-19 1 year later. Take it away, Rich.
Hi, I'm Rich Frazier. I'm the Senior Consultant with IPM Advancement. And on this episode, we're speaking with Jana Olslund, an IPM Consultant in Jacksonville, Florida, and Penny Cowden, an IPM Consultant in Gearhart, Oregon. So we want to follow up on our episode from last year about nonprofits navigating through COVID-19. It's been a year, and we can see the light at the end of the tunnel. But Penny, Jana, what are you seeing in the nonprofit sector right now? How have nonprofits changed to survive during COVID?
I have seen not-for-profits. Some are digging themselves out. They panicked and had no clue what to do. They didn't have the infrastructure in place. And so some have been working on that. I've seen not-for-profits sort of reinventing themselves and looking at their infrastructure. But I've seen not-for-profits that never stopped fundraising really get creative and learn different techniques and different outreach methods. So I've seen a lot of creativity, but I've also seen a lot of stopped in their tracks kind of reaction to COVID. And I think that those who stopped are now trying to figure out, okay, we're coming out of it. Now, what do we do?
So this is where really sound nonprofit practices come into play. It's where we're seeing those who have good organizational structure. Jana, what are you seeing?
Actually, Rich, just to that point, the organizations that I have been working with and that I've seen that have thrived through the pandemic are those that really went back to the core principles of development work. When we went into the lockdown mode, they didn't give up. They found new ways to cultivate and engage their prospects and their donors so that as their networks became more emerging from the COVID bubble, they were more apt and already just continuing on that runway. And their fundraising actually did not halt. It actually increased in a lot of regards because of the smart work that they were able to do during the period of which when you could have easily just kind of closed in and stalled. So I have seen a lot of really good fundraising, a lot of smart fundraising. And several organizations are not only tracking with where they should be for this year against their goals, but they're actually surpassing and hitting milestones where they should be perhaps in the fourth quarter.
That's the great thing about the not-for-profit sector, though, right? This is where we figure stuff out. And it's in an instance like COVID-19 or any sort of disaster mode where our donors really come to the forefront. You know, those organizations that they support, they never stop supporting. And we heard that loud and clear a year ago. And those organizations, as you said, that kept fundraising, they saw that come true. Where's the struggle still? I mean, are there things that we haven't figured out yet, though?
I think one of the things that I'm starting to see is that the struggle is inside the organization, in that there are new job opportunities becoming available. The job search market really went stagnant, went cold for a period of time, and now development officers are beginning to shuffle around. So now you're beginning, while you had a pretty flatline, non-moving staff, a very stable staff, now you're getting to those points where you're seeing instability within the team again, which you bring that back to the donor relationship. You had a really nice period of time, which to cultivate and steward and hopefully solicit engagements and gifts. And now you're starting to see some of that starting to shake and perhaps shake loose again, which comes back to the point where you need to focus on the team before you can focus externally.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah. Penny, what about you?
I haven't really paid a lot of attention to staffing. I've been more focused on creative communications. You know, we all are in a lot of Zoom meetings, and I think that I see people getting really burned out on Zoom meetings and wanting to get back in front of donors. But I think that we really have to be smart about this and look at a hybrid model of communications, in person and virtual, and communication techniques that kind of maybe we didn't use before. So there's virtual events, and I think they have to be much more sophisticated in communication strategies, because I don't think we can go back to whatever we called normal. I think folks are going to need to really up their game in the communications arena. So I see the struggle with that, in that, you know, how do we take what we learned to be able to be virtual, but bring it to a point where it helps us instead of seemingly stops us from communicating?
So what kind of strategies are you seeing or are you suggesting? I mean, when we zoom out to sort of a strategic perspective, what should we be paying attention to?
Well, I think there's going to be a greater emphasis now than there was before with the use of technology in fundraising, whether it's video, mass appeals, or text messaging to donors. I have seen that really resonate with donors. The text messaging and having group calls with like-minded donors. So if there are donors interested in the arts, you know, the performances, I think was a good example that they would put performances on virtually, and to stay relevant and stay top of mind to donors and the value that they bring. So I think there are ways to continue doing that, those kinds of things that are very beneficial. So I think we have to have a model where we are using that technology we've been forced to use, but now getting to a point where we use it to enhance in-person communications.
Jana?
I like the part of when Penny ended about the enhancement. One thing that I've noticed is that those that are closest to the organization, say board members or elite donor groups, when the pandemic first set in, they were really in awe of some of what I was seeing clients do with regard to engagement activities or engagement events. They were doing, I had a client that was doing very high-end donor cultivation events where they had food service delivered to the donors' homes, and they had almost like in-home cocktail parties. That was kind of a thing last spring. It was novel and people really enjoyed it. And now we're entering this year period, and some of those that are close to the organization, such as some board members and those top level donors, are actually outwardly saying, I'm ready to go and meet in person again and get away from the screen. So internally, we've got to figure out the right balance between the technology and the in-person and not be reliant on one or the other.
So what are your thoughts on bringing back in-person fundraising events? If you think yes, what should nonprofits consider when planning their event? And if not, what should we be looking at to know when is the right time?
I'm happy to jump in on that one. I am, again, I'm in Florida. Things are mostly open. As the winter kind of came to a close and now we're in the midst of spring, golf tournaments are back in action here. And what was a massively reduced, at least 50% scale of the golf tournaments, for example, what I started hearing from those within the state was that you can't make money by doing a golf tournament at a 50% capacity. It's hard to scrape even with full capacity. So as the weeks and the months have gone by, those that have had golf tournaments on the books, say for April into May and now into June, they too are increasing what their capacity is. So they're reopening the sponsorships, they're reopening the foursomes, relaxing it used to be take and go for the dinners, and now they're having full dinners again, outside, but full dinners. And I think one thing I've noticed is that there's a little asterisk on some of the invites that if you're not comfortable with this, then we'll make certain accommodations. So you're accommodating those that are attending in a different way, but the expectation is that it's almost back to normal. But again, here we're outdoors mostly as well.
Penny, I'm sort of expecting a different answer from you.
I live in the Pacific Northwest. It rains a lot. You may have heard that it rains a lot in the Pacific Northwest. So outdoor events are always, in the best of times, are always the turkey shoot. You always have to have a plan B in case you can't be outside. We are still very mask oriented. We are still very much seemingly in the midst of COVID. We are slower to open up and quicker to close back up again. Where I live on the Oregon coast, we've opened up and closed like 3 times. So it's just a matter of where you are, I think, on the state level. But I do know that people want to meet in person, and the vaccination card has become important. You know, have you been vaccinated? Do you want to meet? Can we meet outside? I think in the spring. But it's still very much based on COVID restrictions and recommendations for contact. So I don't know. I honestly don't know what the future of events will be. I think that when you have your social donors and they want the events, that there might be ways to have smaller ones. I, for one, am a big, huge fan of smaller events at donors' homes. So maybe they have, I can see us doing things outside at donors' homes with a deck or something, and people are vaccinated. But the big events, I apologize because I know that they're very important to a lot of not-for-profits, but I've never actually seen the value in those huge events. So I'm not sure I'm the best person to talk about events coming back, because I did bigger events, a signature event, because you had to keep your job. But I like smaller events. I think they're more intimate. I worked in healthcare, so you could bring a couple doctors to talk about why this new cancer center is important. And I just got I felt there was a lot more impact because you had time to really visit with people. So COVID, I think, could bring that more into the forefront for not-for-profits, in that having smaller events they're less expensive and they may have bigger impact. So,
and Penny, to that point, I'm working with an organization right now who did a smaller-ish, I think 20 or so person cultivation event in Texas a couple of weeks ago. And it was very much pitched as the come and listen to what we've been up to. No ask associated with it at all. And what they weren't prepared for were people saying, we're ready to write checks. It was almost as if they've emerged from their bubble and they were ready to give back.
I'm always prepared for people to write checks. No problem there. But I take your point.
And I, for one, I'm there with you, Penny. I'm hoping that one positive thing to come out of COVID might be that we find a way to live without so many events. I'm with you. My clients, I make it no secret that I'm not a big fan of doing events. They're not cost effective, and if you're going to do big events, they need to raise a lot of money or raise a lot of friends. And if they're not doing either one, you need to stop doing it.
Hi, this is Curtis from IPM Advancement jumping in for a moment. If you're a nonprofit professional who has questions about your program, or maybe you feel like you've taken your advocacy, fundraising, or membership effort as far as you can and you need some fresh ideas, we have a special offer for you today. NPFX podcast listeners can get a free 30-minute consultation with IPM, no strings attached, when you go to ipmadvancement.com/free. Just enter a few details and an IPM team member will contact you to follow up. It's that easy. That website again is ipmadvancement.com/free. Thanks for listening, and we hope to talk to you soon. Now let's return to the episode.
So, we often talk about storytelling in our approach to fundraising, right? So the idea that nonprofits should be sharing stories of how donor support of their services helps transform people's lives. How does COVID come into that story now? The impact that it's had on the not-for-profit or the people served by that organization? How do we acknowledge COVID in a way that's authentic and yet compelling?
As in speaking about COVID to their donors?
Yes.
This is how we were impacted? I think to a certain extent, but I'm a true believer in organizations having no needs. So they're there to meet community needs and can talk about how they're the best organization to do that for whatever particular mission and need that their community has that allows them existence. So I think that they would be better served talking about the impact they've been able to have during COVID, still have their mission advance and still have an impact on the health or well-being of the people they serve. So I think in that context, it would be good, but I don't think in isolation, it would be a good message.
Jana, how do you feel?
I think being able to share the high points of the last year are important. For so many, last year was a moment to do a lot of self-reflection. It was oftentimes painted with a very sad or dark brush. And I think there are a lot of organizations that can tell a story about how the program side of the organizations thrived. They didn't shut down. They found unique ways to be creative. And I think by telling those types of stories or having people that were the frontline workers or the program officers within the organization share those types of stories and open up those line of communications with our prospects, with our donors, I think that's going to be what helps an organization stand apart and help raise additional money. Not necessarily the violin and the sad strings of what can happen and having it sing a song of we desperately need your money, but rather what we did creatively to thrive through it and I'm now on the other side of it.
Yeah. I think it's fair to acknowledge that COVID existed, and this is how we reacted to that in a way that advanced our mission and stewarded your dollar. And here's how we're moving forward. Let's move forward now. So, Penny, earlier you referenced sort of how organizations, some organizations maybe didn't have their act together at the beginning of COVID, and so that sort of was exaggerated during COVID-19. So what are some of the weaknesses that were exposed in the nonprofit sector then, from your vantage point?
I think a huge weakness is the lack of endowment money. So a lot of organizations, they do annual giving and major giving, but they pay less attention to endowment building. And I think the organizations that had endowment dollars to help them see it through, didn't have to lay off staff, could keep running programs. I think that they were in a much better position. When I was introduced to endowment, my mentor said it's a rainy day fund. It's like your savings account for rainy days. And I see a lot of not-for-profits that don't have a rainy day account. And that really was put into stark relief during COVID. And I also think that on the flip side of that a lot of organizations that are grant giving lessened their restrictions on giving to try to help more, not-for-profits. So some foundations that only, follow the 5% rule, they threw that out and did much more giving during COVID to help not-for-profits that didn't have a rainy day fund. But my point being that this will not be our last crisis. So lesson learned is the importance of focusing some attention on building endowment funds.
That's a great point, because it just seems like endowment funds and endowment fundraising had gone out of favor and popularity in recent years, right? And now all of a sudden, hey, guess what? We've had a whole year of rainy days.
Well, and building endowment. So I have a foundation that I work with and has spent that time building endowment. Endowment giving is very different. It's more typically endowment funds are built through plan gifts.
Yeah.
So plan gifts don't take cash right now. So donors who were having trouble or couldn't give cash, but they could do some planning and some endowment gifts. So we focus there and have been successful. So the next crisis that comes up, they will have a rainy day fund. So I just think that one of the opportunities during COVID was to raise money through plan gifts rather than major gifts. And I don't know how many organizations went there or thought that, but I thought it was really important.
Yeah. So Jana, what kind of weaknesses have you seen exposed through COVID? And let me turn the table on that as well and ask, what kind of opportunities are we seeing coming out of COVID?
Absolutely. I'm going to take a slightly different bend, and I'm going to look inside the organization. And I think one of the things I've witnessed is that on the onset of COVID, it made all of us look internally. Our outward networks closed down. So inside the organizations, we were forced to, think about how to raise money differently, whether it was for emergency fundraising purposes or whatever it might have been, but B, to quote an organization I work with, how to keep ourselves busy. So there were a lot of new things that percolated internally that perhaps in the past got backburnered that started to rise to the surface because we needed to find purpose and we needed to figure out what was going to work. So one of the things that became a weakness was the central services aspect of some organizations, the infrastructure, not the outward fundraisers, but the team behind the scenes weren't as ramped up as perhaps they could have been. And what that did is it helped show not only the importance of the central services team, the researchers, the database people within the organization, but if those processes were not well-tuned and in place prior to COVID, it really amplified the importance of those positions because now you had 3, 6, 8, 9 fundraisers asking for massive data lists, asking for a ton of research in ways that hadn't been researched before. If your database wasn't coded appropriately, those types of things that you can kind of get by because you've got a machine going, an annual machine going, for example, but all of a sudden that machine stops and now there's a backlog or you realize you can't do things. And I think as we start to emerge from that, I hope people realize the importance of those teams that are in the office and not out in the field, if you will, because they're really the ones that help keep the frontline fundraisers moving forward.
And God bless them. We can't live without
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I think that's a huge opportunity, I think, is to make sure that organizations have the budget, the wherewithal, the relationship with HR to be able to look at that aspect of the fundraising, the department, and make sure it's where it should be, if not greater than.
So let's stay in that organizational zone there, and acknowledging that the future is going to continue to hold variables and unknowns when it comes to COVID, just like the last year has. What should nonprofits be doing to remain nimble enough to face the challenges that we can't predict?
Well, I agree with Jana. I think a lot of not-for-profits were caught off guard in that their management systems and data management systems weren't up to date. So they had, that's what gets put on the back burner, right? Cleaning up your database, making sure you have mobile numbers for texting, making sure you have emails and complete donor records and that kind of thing. I think that goes right along with what Jana was saying, that I saw some not-for-profits really have to work on their databases, because without a clean database, they couldn't use the different communication techniques as effectively, like texting and kind of personalized communications and that thing. I also think that Jana touched on it earlier. A big problem in the sector is turnover. And while there weren't any jobs and everybody was kind of just holding their breath, people didn't switch jobs, but now they're starting to. And I think that puts in really high relief just the problem we have with keeping people in their positions and keeping fundraisers happy. I think that's something that we really, as a sector, need to look at, and why.
That's actually a great idea for a future episode.
Yeah.
So Jana, what are your thoughts there?
On the being nimble enough aspect?
Yes.
I think the biggest lesson for me in that aspect for the last year is for a development operation to not get so locked in. I think it's really easy for a fundraising team to know that in January you do this, in March you do this, and you have these cycles, and to know that in any way, shape, or form that could be upended. So to know that your team, for example, in an organization that may be actually any size, I was going to say large, but in any size, you've got your team that maybe they have their frontline fundraisers have priorities. They are, for example, in a healthcare space, they're service line orientated, cardiology, cancer, so on and so forth. But to know that your frontline fundraisers have knowledge across that spectrum and not so in their specific own lane, because one of the things I noticed early last year is, for example, outpatient surgeries stopped at most healthcare institutions. And all the fundraisers then needed to coalesce around emergency fundraising or something like that. And I saw a lot of organizations having a hard time ramping up their teams to understand how the rest of the organization worked. So to make sure that your fundraisers are not so myopic in their thinking and their abilities to speak, and back to what Penny and I both spoke about, is now as likely staff moves around and you start to see these shaking inside the organizations, you're going to have gaps within the organization. And to know that you've got a frontline fundraiser who can not only talk the talk with the prospect about what's happening with cancer, but also cardiology or something to that effect, and not lose the steam with your top prospects that you've worked hard over the last year to build.
The economic impact of COVID-19 can't be denied, and it's had an impact on individuals. How can nonprofits engage those supporters who can't give money right now? How do we make those donors feel like they still matter?
Well, I think that donors who can't give money right now are prime plan gift donors. Talking to them about a longer term gift. So I would say that they've become even more important because they could be really ready for a planned gift conversation that can lead to endowment. But I don't think you should ever treat donors differently because their financial circumstances are temporarily changed. So I was doing, just to give an example of a story, I was doing a huge campaign, a $20 million campaign for a hospital that right in the middle of it, we had the crash, in, I think it was 98, when we had that big crash. And the chair of the campaign said, I can't do this. I got to go, man. I'm going to lose my business. So the chair left, and then other donors who had already committed were calling in and saying, we can't make this gift now. We've been really economically impacted by this crash, and we can't make the gift. So rather than saying, oh, we understand, we said, how about we look at how we can make that gift still work for you? And we came up with different pledge periods. We came up with deferred gifts. We did everything we possibly could individually, donor by donor, to work for them because they still wanted to give,
Mm-hmm.
right? They still want to give. They're just not in a financial position right now. But if you talk to a donor and say, in a year from now, this is probably going to look a lot different. How about we defer your gift for a year? And we found a new chair and had a big party to enter. This new chair was taking over phase 2 of the campaign, which we just invented because there really wasn't a phase 2. But the point being that those donors who wanted to back out of their gifts were in a very tough financial spot, but we found a way to work with them. And I will tell you that a lot of those donors increased their gifts after things started coming back because they felt like we truly cared about them.
I think that's an excellent point. At the end of the day, it really just, it all goes back to meeting the donor's needs.
Yeah.
Jana?
The one thing, I'm thinking, as Penny was talking, I was thinking back to the 2007, 2008 world. And one of the lessons that I think we could bring back today, just to this point, Rich, is that I'm back to the staffing thing again, but looking at your team, and for those that maybe aren't at that top prospect level, but that are in that mid-tier perhaps, and looking at how they could be reassigned to a donor engagement or a stewardship officer and elevating those roles within the foundation office is something really important and meaningful. Oftentimes, I think they don't have as much weight or as much importance in some people's eyes as, say, a major gift officer or principal gift officer. But this would be a really good opportunity for people who either by their words or by their actions are showing that they can't make a gift of what they used to be doing, rather than putting them into a lapsed pool and into an annual fund cycle. Make something really special for them and don't let them go, because this is temporary, more than likely.
Yeah.
And how to keep them fully engaged, just perhaps in a new way or by a new someone within the organization.
Excellent point. I want to ask you about nonprofits as community leaders. So IPM believes that nonprofits are more than just the sum of the services they provide, as they are often leaders in their communities. They provide guidance and inspiration for people to be better and do better. Can you give some examples of how nonprofits that you've worked with have stepped up and helped their communities through the toughest parts of the pandemic?
Well, that one's easy for me. Just because I work so much in the healthcare space, it's been very touching to watch people within the healthcare community be so selfless in what they do and they give up over this last year to help care for and protect their communities, whether it be putting in extra hours and staying away from their families. Particularly think back to where we were last spring, where we weren't sure how the coronavirus spread. People were staying not at their homes. Healthcare workers were not staying at their homes. I've seen in some of the hospitals I've been working with where not the foundation office, but direct frontline healthcare workers doing their own little mini fundraising events, doing their own little give back events, food for first responding teams, way to give back to other people, knowing that they're giving so much, not thinking of themselves. So I think that is just so remarkable. And I think there's stories there that need to be told and not forgotten.
Penny, what about you?
Well, I work with a client that it's a national foundation, and it was established as a kindness foundation to promote, inspire a kinder world. And I think during COVID, we saw a true need for people having mindfulness of being kind to people. COVID was very difficult for communities, for individuals. It's everybody has their own COVID nightmare story. Let's just say none of us escaped unscathed. But I think that foundations and communities really demonstrated kindness throughout, and not-for-profits demonstrated enormous kindness and generosity to their communities, and just developed a more accepting, more grateful kind of stance, if you will, is what I saw. So I saw a lot of national mindfulness about being kind to each other and individual community kindness. You know, there were food drives here for folks who were, you know, didn't have money to buy groceries. There were huge food drives. There were huge housing drives. Housing here is a big issue. So a lot of creative housing, because people were losing their apartments, they were losing their houses. So the communities came together, led by not-for-profits. So the food bank, you know, really created a lot of attention for that. And the real estate market here really created a lot of attention, the real estate foundation, a lot of attention around helping people with housing, and all of those byproducts of the pandemic that affected individuals somehow became owned by the communities, and they got together and helped solve them. You know, de Tocqueville talked about this, and I've read that book, but I feel like I really saw it in action, how Americans, when there's an issue, they come together and create a solution. And so for me, it was very heartwarming. And I felt grateful, but I also felt blessed because, wow, look at what people can do when they just decide to do it.
Wow, I'm so glad that you brought that up. You know, we talk about how divided the country is so often, and I remember feeling just what you described, both of you, in the earlier months of the pandemic, March through June. You know, we were all stuck in our homes, and I just remember walking around the neighborhood and, you know, just seeing various acts of kindness around my neighborhood, and then seeing acts of kindness around the world. So as we wrap up, I want to ask you for final takeaways. If there's just one piece of advice you'd want nonprofits to take away from today's episode, even if it's something that we haven't talked about, what would it be?
I think for me, it's kind of a meld between remembering the basics of not only development and the operation, but also why you got into this field in the first place. I think there's so many of us that got into fundraising likely by accident, and also, but with a good heart, and that we wanted to get into nonprofit work to help others. And you fill in that blank with whatever your passion might be. But I think just exactly to what Penny was just talking about is that this last year has really forced us all in a way to stop and reflect and think about how things that are bigger than ourselves and how we can help others. We've seen others in need. And I think this is a really good opportunity for nonprofit organizations to not lose sight of that, but to amplify that both as a mission, but also as personal goals, both in terms of the staff you have and the staff you perhaps are going to be bringing on in the future, and making sure that you have the team that reflects your mission. Because what better way right now to do it than with all of us that have had this moment in time to really think about where we want to be with our lives and how we can make change.
Penny?
I think for me, it's learning to expand your communication toolkit. Philanthropy is all about communication. It's about caring and communicating that caring. It's about using money for good and to create something where nothing was, or to, you know, build that dream, right? Donors have dreams. They want to see them happen. So I think being more open to working with donors on their dreams instead of the organization's needs might be something to take away. I think we have found that donors really, you know, as Jana indicated, they want to give, they want to make an impact. But a lot of times not-for-profits get so caught up in what they want to do. I want to build this new surgery center. I want to build this new library or whatever. They don't go out to donors and talk with them about that or get their ideas. So an example is my very first fundraising job, when I still thought it was marketing. The community came to the hospital and said, "We have a problem in this community. We do not have any mental health programs for children, and we mean young children, and every study shows that it's under 5 that sets the stage. So what are you going to help us do about it? They came to us and we were willing to listen. We had no plans to do that, no plans at all, but the community did. And to me, that has always been my gold standard, that partnership between community and not-for-profit and listening to each other. So I would say that's a basic, but maybe it's not so basic. So that would be me. I would be really looking for those true partnerships, not just how are those donors going to help us get what we need to do.
I want to say thank you to both of you, Penny and Jana, for participating in this episode. You know, we're a year plus down the road from the beginning of this pandemic. And, you know, we're in a much different position than we were at the beginning of the pandemic. And we're not out of the woods yet, but arguably we're in a better position, and we're closer to the other side of this thing. And it's very nice to hear stories and messages of positivity and opportunity in the not-for-profit sector. And I think now, you know, our takeaway and for the not-for-profit sector is, let's go fulfill what we are here for. Let's go make the world a better place and continue to be kind to one another. So thank you for being with us on this episode.
Thank you, Rich. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Rich.
That wraps up our discussion about fundraising and COVID-19 1 year later. Thanks to our panel, Rich Frazier, Jana Olslund, and Penny Cowden, for sharing their insights and expertise. If you'd like to learn more about our panel members, we'll include that information in the show notes. If you like this episode, please subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast app. And leave us a review. Reviews are one of the best ways you can help us reach more nonprofit professionals like yourself. For back episodes and more resources like white papers, infographics, and blog articles, please visit the free IPM Advancement Nonprofit Resource Library at ipmadvancement.com/resources. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.